In addition to workers on the front lines and the variety of barriers they face depending on their social location, it's also important to consider the experiences of workers who are now working from home, possibly for the first time. We know that on average, occupations that are telecommuter friendly tend to involve higher income and less health risk of exposure to coronavirus. At the same time, as workers work from home, this can put pressure on other aspects of their life, including family and roommate relationships. We've discussed how there can be a spillover, particularly for parents, that has disproportionately had a negative economic impact on mothers. The second shift is the concept that refers to the unpaid work often done by women in the domestic sphere, such as grocery shopping, food preparation, childcare, elder care, and cleaning. When the idea of the second shift was initially conceptualized by Dr. Arlie Russell Hochschild in 1989, this represented two different shifts that women did. First, a full day of paid labor outside the home, and then another shift of unpaid invisible labor inside the home. With work from home under the pandemic, combined with fewer childcare options and the closure of schools, the public and private spheres of paid and unpaid labor are merging, putting substantial stress on families with children. There are other issues to consider. As telecommuting increases, preliminary data shows that workers tend to increase their hours rather than reduce them. And it can be hard to create a boundary between work time and personal time. Ergonomic issues can also arise from poor work areas, and it can be socially isolating, as typical interactions with coworkers disappear quite suddenly. There's also legal questions emerging about who is responsible for workplace incidents that arise when a worker is working at home. Urban sociologists are also asking questions about urban planning. As many companies develop more robust telecommuting options, will people escape from living at the core of expensive cities and move further away? A flip side is that some households now need larger dwellings in order to accommodate not just personal space, but an office space as well, which has implications for real estate, with wealthier households having more options available to them financially to adapt to these changing circumstances. Above all else, this mass shift to telework, at least for higher income occupations, is challenging the traditional notion of the ideal worker. The ideal worker has been based on a vision of a worker, typically assumed to be male, who starts working early in their 20s and continues to work full-time, the full year until retirement. This worker rarely gets sick, doesn't give birth, and does not have family and household responsibilities that can interfere with their work. The ideal worker made some sense within the more heteronormative breadwinning homemaker model that arose as paid labor outside the home became common around the time of the Industrial Revolution and remained as the dominant model until women began entering the paid formal workforce in large numbers in Canada in the 1980s. This idea is, of course, gendered. It assumes that this worker has a partner who can dedicate themselves full-time to taking care of domestic, childcare, and elder parent responsibilities, which is now rarely the case, as more and more people are single and choosing to remain single, and more families are dual earners. Under the pandemic, the illusion that workers do not have these extended responsibilities outside of work has been broken. Pets and children and partners and parents are making cameos in Zoom meetings all over the world. Workers and their family members are getting sick and need care. Children don't have a school to go to. In their May 2020 Harvard Business Review article, Joan Williams wrote, "As a smart person once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And let's not waste this one. Instead, let's work together to ensure that a silver lining of this vast and frightening pandemic is a new definition of the worker as someone who's ambitious, focused, and committed, but who must also balance work obligations with caregiving responsibilities." What are some ways that companies can support this new definition of the worker? Williams writes that we must continue to further institutionalize telework. Occupations that never before had teleworking as an option have now demonstrated under COVID-19 that this can be possible. The unthinkable is now thinkable, doable, and has been done in many cases. Other important steps are institutionalizing flexible hours for childcare responsibilities, and perhaps most importantly, government-funded and regulated affordable childcare. Lastly, we turn to considering global inequalities in work and workplaces. In Canada, many workers have been wearing personal protective equipment, although they have had to reuse some of this equipment or go without during shortages, particularly at the beginning of lockdown. Overwhelmingly, though, this personal protective equipment was produced in other countries and imported to countries like Canada. Let's take a moment to look at the workers behind the personal protective equipment. This piece by journalist Jane Feynman finds that there has been massive exploitation and abuse in the production of these personal protective equipment items, especially under COVID-19. Medical gloves alone are a huge market. Even before COVID, 300 billion medical gloves were used globally in 2019. Under COVID, the production of medical equipment like gloves has been called the Personal Protective Equipment Global Arms Race. Top Glove is the largest glove manufacturing company in the world. In 2018 and 2019, Top Glove was accused of forced labor, withholding wages, confiscating passports, and debt bondage in its factories in Malaysia. Top Glove denies the allegations. Although some countries have started to ban importing items like rubber gloves from companies with substantial evidence of labor abuse, Feynman writes that under COVID especially, these ethical concerns became less of a priority. Reports are also emerging from certain Hong Kong prisons where female inmates are said to be forced to work night shifts, making millions of face masks to keep up with demand. These prison authorities have been accused of modern slavery. In early 2020, the World Health Organization warned that, quote, "The chronic global shortage of personal protective gear is among the most urgent threats to virus containment efforts." With such a need for protective gear, workers' rights have been overlooked in some cases. For example, Malaysian factories were supposed to implement a temporary 50% reduction in the production of gloves under the national lockdown. Yet, some of these factories are reported to have continued operating at 100% capacity. The good news is that we have some power over where we get our personal protective equipment. Medical professionals can campaign for their hospital, association, or organization to purchase medical supplies ethically. They can also stay informed about fair medical trade. Fair medical trade is essentially the fair trade movement applied to the context of medical equipment. The goal is to modify the sourcing practices of large organizations that purchase medical equipment, and ensuring they take steps to assess the rights and labor conditions of the people making their products. According to the British Medical Association, this includes, quote, working with supplier companies throughout the supply chain to help their workers to access fundamental rights, such as the right to safe and decent working conditions, to be paid at least the legal minimum wage, to join and form unions so they can bargain collectively for their rights, and to require the elimination of child labor. As a member of the public, you can research the companies where you purchase COVID masks or other gear. You can engage friends and family in discussing what you find, and you can ask your healthcare providers and anyone else who purchases masks and gloves where they get them from. Returning to the World Economic Forum report, the fourth trend identified in this report is on a global scale. Quote, "The pandemic is increasing poverty and inequality between richer countries that can afford to bail out their firms and provide social safety nets, and poorer countries that do not have the capacity to do so." As we've talked about workers and workplace conditions under the pandemic, we've continued to come back to national context, policies, and workers' resources and rights. This is important to consider in any analysis, particularly under COVID-19. I'd now like to turn to the primary topic of our module, sex work under COVID-19. So why would we study sex work in relation to this pandemic? Sex work is the exchange of money for sexual services provided by a consenting adult. So we're not focusing on sex trafficking here, although that has likely been impacted as well, including by border shutdowns. How are workers in the sex industry affected by COVID? This specific issue is discussed in a commentary by British Columbia MP Dr. Hetty Fry, published in May 2020. Dr. Fry writes, quote, "We have seen the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on marginalized communities. As the Government of Canada rolled out emergency supports for individuals, small and medium-sized businesses, students, seniors, arts, culture, sports, and nonprofit sectors, it became evident that there were some groups that went unserved and unnoticed. One of the groups with no income, no access to resources, precariously housed, and food insecure, and who may be forced at this time of pandemic to work in risky situations in order to survive, are workers in the sex trade," unquote. The article continues, "Most sex workers are not eligible for Canada's emergency response benefits, for Canada's emergency wage subsidy, for grants or rent assistance. They face evictions, food insecurity, and poor access to public health services. They have families to feed, and despite fears for their health and physical safety, they are pushed even further to the margins in order to survive," end quote. In this week's lesson, we consider how relief funds are accessible or not to workers in the sex industry under the pandemic. We also ask how this access to emergency funds is informed by Canadian legislation around sex work. And we'll look at this in cross-national comparative perspective. We'll examine a case study of sex worker legislation and COVID emergency funds access in New Zealand. We'll also think about how different forms of sex work are impacted by the pandemic, lockdown, and physical distancing. Experts note in particular that as sex workers have reduced incomes and little government support under COVID, they become even more vulnerable to exploitation. And we'll consider existing inequities between sex workers and how these inequities are exacerbated under COVID. This article, titled, quote, "How Sex Workers Are Keeping Clients in Line in a Pandemic," shows how some clients are pressuring sex workers to continue face-to-face services, and sometimes even without protections. The article features real text message exchanges between workers and clients, although I think the one shown here is a joke. We see in this image in the top right a client asking for a face-to-face session, and the worker responding via text, "Sure babe, I'll wear my new outfit for you. Wanna see?" and then sending a picture of a full-body hazmat suit. We will ask whether all sex workers have this much flexibility to choose whether and how to see clients in this pandemic time. And we'll consider what factors increase and decrease sex worker autonomy and choice in this time of crisis. We'll finish by looking at the ways workers in the sex industry have adapted and innovated to support themselves financially under physical distancing and lockdown. In particular, we explore the dramatic shift to online sex work and some benefits and limitations of this trend. Our guest lecturer for this lesson is Dr. Becky Ross, UBC professor in sociology and the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. Professor Ross is also a faculty associate of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Dr. Ross's research interrogates themes of sexual and gender identity, racial and ethnic diversity, community formation, space and place, and state regulation. In particular, Dr. Ross probes discourses and practices of identities, families, communities, and the nation in the context of legacies of colonial rule, medicalization, stigmatization, and criminalization. I feature here one of Dr. Ross's books, Burlesque West: Showgirls, Sex, and Sin in Post-War Vancouver. In 2008, Professor Ross co-founded Vancouver's West End Sex Worker Memorial Project, and in 2019, she won the Angus Reid Practitioners Applied Sociology Award with her community collaborator, Jamie Lee Hamilton. To conclude this lecture, I'll leave you with some underlying questions to consider as you engage with Dr. Ross. Thank you very much.